former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence. Marc Short was in that meeting. He has testified before the grand jury, and he's agreed to join us right here. Mr. Short, thank you for coming on.
Chuck, thanks for having me.
So let me start with the former vice president and what we learned about his note-taking. Was this something he started doing in that period of the pressure campaign, or is this something he was doing quite often?
As you can imagine, the job of Vice President of the United States is a pretty overwhelming position, and there's a lot of information that flows through any single one day. So he would often take notes just to keep facts straight over time. And I think that much of his book and his memoir, So Help Me God, he used those notes to help with the writing of the book. And I think, the special counsel then subpoenaed those notes, and therefore he complied with that subpoena.
Is the vice president sort of resigned to the fact that if there's a trial, he's likely to be one of the most important witnesses for the government?
I don't know, Chuck. I mean, I don't know exactly how these prosecutions go. I do think that I don't think there's much question about what the facts were about the president's pressure campaign with the vice president. It seems that more of the allegations are on the conspiracy and what the president knew or didn't know. And so I don't know. I don't know if he will be or if I will be or others will be called to be witnesses yet.
The former vice president told me he thought that former President Trump was led astray by his lawyers, many of whom are those unindicted co-conspirators. In fact, let me play what he said to me.
The first time I heard in early December somebody suggest that as vice president I might be able to decide which votes to reject and which to accept, I knew that it was false. Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear.
Do you think that, given everything we've learned now, the president just sat there and let these crackpot lawyers do this? I mean, he had no involvement here whatsoever. Is that really the defense here?
Well, I don't think so, Chuck. I do think he had some crazy-ass lawyers around him, but I think there's no doubt he sought them out. But I don't think in any way is the vice president exonerated him. He's been pretty clear and open that what the president asked him to do was a violation of his oath to protect the country, and he was asking the vice president to violate his oath to the Constitution on the day of January 6th. But I got to say, what I think has been the most remarkable thing in the last 24 hours is, in essence, the president's team putting forward the First Amendment defense. Because I don't know. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and maybe they're right that, if you're going to prosecute people for false information, then you'd have to prosecute Democrat elected officials too. But that's a giant shift from 2.5 years of telling the American people the election was stolen. I have the facts. I just never got to present my case because Congress wouldn't hear it or the courts wouldn't hear it. If that was the case, he could walk in now and present it and the conspiracies would go away. But if instead they're saying, look, everyone has a First Amendment right to mislead the American people, well, then obviously he's been misleading the American people and misleading about what the vice president's role was.
So what you're saying is that he can't have it both ways. He can't have his First Amendment rights and at the same time somehow question what Mike Pence did with false information.
Exactly, Chuck. I mean, again, maybe he does have a First Amendment right to mislead the American people. And look, we're in the nation's capital where there are plenty of elected officials who do that. I accept that. But then you're making the point that I have been misleading the American people for the last 2.5 years, if that's my defense. And it's not really that I really thought all this information was true and the vice president had this authority that no other vice president in 250 years of our republic has ever used, nor one that we would want Kamala Harris to have in 2024 to unilaterally throw out states and in that certification.
To me, the most powerful part of the indictment was the tick-tock on the elector scheme, because we can have a debate about what did he believe, what didn't he believe. This was an action that was taken on his behalf. What was your awareness of how aggressive this electoral vote strategy was? When did you become aware of just how extensive it was?
Chuck, I even kind of to this day question the extensiveness of it. In my mind, there were a lot of people throwing mud at the wall or trying to see what would stick, and it was not really a real thought out strategy. The vice president, as you remember, was traveling the country trying to encourage states to reopen as the leader of the COVID task force. The vice president went to Georgia 6 different times campaigning for those 2 special elections. And so many of those meetings that I guess were happening to elicit false electors were done really without our office's knowledge or the vice president's knowledge. And so it wasn't really until the last day or two that we became really more aware of that. And interestingly, the vice president asked the Senate parliamentarian on January 3rd about alternate sets of electors, and they said, we get them. Every average citizen will send them in every 4 years.
Sure.
But it means nothing. It means nothing unless the state has certified them. And so the question is, have other states certified? If you go back to the vice president's remarks on presiding over that ceremony, he would say no other slate having been certified by their state, he then moves forward to go ahead with the proceedings.
Up till now, Republican voters have not been moved by these allegations. What do you think? Why do you think that is? And do you think there's a way for their minds to change? Because if they do, Mike Pence might be their guy.
Maybe, Chuck. I don't know. I think that the reality is that each indictment has rallied Republican supporters around the president. And I think that fairly, for a lot of Republicans, they look back on those 4 years as a lot that was accomplished in a conservative agenda that they're really proud of and believe that, Donald Trump was defending a lot of our beliefs from attack from the left. And so there's sort of a built-in, I think, sense from Republicans that he's under attack now. We're going to defend him. And I think that, that's understandable. And I think there was a lot that was great that was accomplished that he deserves credit for. But having said that, I think that the events of January 6th were absolutely tragic. And I think the president had an enormous dereliction of duty on that day and the days leading up to it.
Is this disqualifying? In your mind?
In my mind, it is. Sure. I mean, I think if you basically are president of the United States and you willfully ask your vice president to disregard his oath to the Constitution, I think that is disqualifying for whether you're conservative or liberal. But I think that that is a decision for American voters to make moving forward.
You've spoken with both the January 6th committee and with the grand jury. Obviously, you can't disclose the grand jury process specifically. I get that. But I'm just curious, the difference, what was similar, what was the same? How would you compare the two experiences?
Well, I wouldn't wish them on anyone, Chuck. I mean, I think in both cases I was subpoenaed before that testimony. But I think that in each case that the people leading those hearings were incredibly professional with us. And I think, we told our story and leave it up to others to judge whether or not there's events that can be prosecuted from them.
Jack Smith did not charge the former president with incitement. In some ways, I think agreeing with the potential First Amendment argument on that front. But he did allege that Donald Trump exploited the violence. That's something you and the vice president would agree with?
Well, I don't want to speak for the vice president. I think, as I was there in the Capitol that day, that I would certainly agree with that. I think that the president did encourage people to march to the Capitol, but I don't think you can hold him at fault for the violence that occurred. I think that the people who conducted the violence are the ones that merit that. But, when in the midst of the violence happening, when the president is tweeting out derogatory and inflammatory and false information about the vice president in the midst of that, I think he bears responsibility for that, sure.
We're going to have a lot of trials and a lot of hearings, and it's all going to happen. I don't know if the legal calendar is now the primary calendar or vice versa. I'm being a little facetious here. But how damaging do you think this could be to the Republican Party if the voters decide to stick with Trump?
Well, I think that what we saw in 2020 is that probably Donald Trump is one of the only ones in the Republican field who could not beat Joe Biden in 2024. And so I think it is something the Republican voters have to come to grips with. And I think there's a bigger question about where our party is headed. I think, again, there was much that was accomplished in those 4 years that is tremendous for conservatives. Whether or not it was reshaping the court, rebuilding our military, getting the tax reform, and securing our border, things that we fought for many years that we can be proud of. But at the same time, the end does not justify the means. And I think if we basically embrace the notion that we can disregard the rule of law when it's in our interest, then I think that that's a bigger challenge for our party moving forward.
Had enough senators voted to convict, would that have been the better outcome?
I don't know, Chuck. I think I have a lot of concerns about whether or not it's appropriate for people to be voting to impeach a president after the term is completed and he doesn't have the ability to defend himself in that proceeding. I think there would have been a lot of due process concerns with that. And so I think the Senate acted appropriately in not impeaching the president.